That's impossible, old man. Nobody hits iron sights at that range. The Marine instructor's voice carried across Camp Pendleton's rifle range with absolute certainty. 76-year-old James stood at the firing line, weathered hands steady on the M40A6 sniper rifle, requesting permission to attempt a shot at the 2,400-meter target. The instructors exchanged amused glances. 3 qualified scout snipers had failed to ring steel at that distance today, even with high-powered optics. This elderly man wanted to try with basic iron sights. The laughter started quietly, then built as more Marines gathered to watch. If you believe skill transcends age and equipment, type "respect" in the comments. James visited the range twice a month. He lived in nearby Oceanside, spent his mornings walking the beach and his afternoons sitting in the small Veterans Center downtown. Nobody knew much about him. He was polite, quiet, kept to himself. He'd asked the range officer months ago if he could observe training sometimes. The officer, recognizing another veteran who missed the sounds and smells of a rifle range, had granted permission. James would sit in the observation area for hours, watching young Marines train. He never offered advice, never criticized, never drew attention to himself. He wore an old canvas jacket regardless of the weather, faded jeans and boots that had seen decades of use. To the instructors and students, he was just another old veteran living in the past. The training that day focused on extreme long-range precision fire. The instructors had set up targets at progressive distances: 800 meters, 1,200 meters, 1,800 meters, and finally 2,400 meters. The 2,400-meter target was more theoretical than practical. They used it to teach students about the limitations of their equipment, the effects of wind and gravity at extreme distances, and the mathematical calculations required for such shots. In 28 years of using this particular range configuration, only one Marine had ever successfully engaged that distant target with the first round. The record stood as a point of pride. These instructors taught hundreds of students. They knew the limits of the rifles, the ammunition, and human capability. James had watched the training all morning. He'd seen talented young Marines struggle with the long-distance shots. He'd observed their techniques, their breathing, their trigger control. When the afternoon session began and the instructor announced they'd demonstrate the impossibility of the 2,400-meter shot with iron sights, James stood slowly. He walked down from the observation area, his gait showing the stiffness of age. "Excuse me, Sergeant," he said quietly. "I'd like to try that shot." The instructor turned, surprised that the old observer was even speaking. "Sir, this is a closed training session. We appreciate your interest, but—" James interrupted gently. "I understand, but if you have 1 round to spare, I'd appreciate the opportunity." The instructor looked at his students. This could be a teaching moment. Let the old man try and fail, then explain why the shot was impossible. "You understand this is iron sights only? No scope, no laser rangefinder, no wind meter. Just the rifle and your eyes." James nodded. "I understand, Sergeant." The instructor gestured to the firing line. "All right, sir. 1 round. But when you miss, I need you to return to the observation area and let us continue with professional instruction." James accepted the M40A6, checked it with practiced efficiency, and settled into a prone position. The Marines watched with barely concealed amusement. One whispered to another, "This is going to be embarrassing. Someone should stop him." James lay behind the rifle, completely still. He didn't rush. His eyes moved to the distant target, barely visible through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. He studied the mirage, the way the air moved, the subtle indicators that experienced shooters learn to read. He made a small adjustment to the iron sights, then another. The instructor standing behind him checked his watch impatiently. This old man was taking forever. "Sir, if you're not comfortable with the shot," James spoke without moving. "I'm reading the wind. Give me a moment." His voice was calm, unbothered by the impatience around him. Another minute passed, then James' breathing slowed. One breath. Two. On the third exhale, his finger pressed the trigger. The shot surprised everyone, not because it was loud, but because it wasn't. The report was clean, controlled, professional. Then came the sound every shooter waits for, the distant, distinctive ring of lead striking steel. The metallic echo rolled back across the range. 2,400 meters away, the target sang. The instructor's mouth opened, but no words came out. He raised his binoculars, confirming what his ears had already told him. Dead center hit. First round, iron sights. By an elderly man who wasn't supposed to be able to see that far, let alone shoot that far. The Marine students stood frozen. The other instructors moved closer, verifying the target through their optics. All confirmed the same impossible result. The senior instructor found his voice first, though it came out rough with shock. Who are you? James stood slowly, safed the rifle, and handed it back with proper courtesy. Just a veteran, Sergeant. Haven't held a rifle in a while. Felt good. But the instructor wasn't accepting that answer. Sir, that's a 28-year range record you just broke. Nobody shoots like that accidentally. What's your background? James shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. I served. Long time ago, different era. He started to turn away, but a young lance corporal had noticed something. The old canvas jacket James wore had shifted when he'd assumed the prone position. The inside lining showed a patch, faded almost to invisibility, but still readable if you looked closely. The lance corporal's voice cut through the stunned silence. Sir, your jacket. There's a patch. James glanced down, realized what the young Marine had seen, and his shoulders sagged slightly. He'd hoped to avoid this conversation. The instructor stepped closer. May I? James nodded permission. The instructor carefully opened the jacket to see the full patch. His face went pale. He read aloud, slowly, his voice filled with growing reverence. Scout Sniper School, Chief Instructor, 1967-1989. Vietnam Service Medal, 3 combat tours. The instructor stepped back as if he'd been pushed. You trained Scout Snipers for 22 years, during Vietnam. James nodded quietly. Started as a student in 1966. Got my hog's tooth in 1967. Did 3 tours in country as an operational sniper. Confirmed kills, well, they don't matter now. Came back in 1973. The Corps asked me to help train the next generation. Taught at the Scout Sniper School until I retired in 1989. Trained about 1,500 Marines total. Some of them probably trained your instructors. The senior instructor's hands were shaking. Sir, I think you did train my instructor, Gunnery Sergeant Matthews. He retired 5 years ago. He used to tell us stories about the old-school instructors who could shoot like it was magic. Said there was one instructor who could hit anything, anywhere, with any rifle. Said he was so good they stopped letting him compete because it wasn't fair to the students. James smiled faintly. Matthews. Good Marine. Excellent instructor himself. Natural talent, just needed refinement. The instructor's mind was racing. Sir, that record you just broke, that was set by Gunnery Sergeant Matthews in 1997. He always said he learned that shot from his instructor. That was you. You taught him that shot, and now you just beat his record. James chuckled. Matthews always had a competitive streak. I'm sure he'd be amused that I finally outshot him. The Marines standing around were processing what they were witnessing. This wasn't just some old veteran. This was a legend. A ghost from their institutional past, a man who'd shaped the very foundation of modern Marine Corps sniper training. The senior instructor made a decision. Sir, would you be willing to stay, to talk to the students? They need to hear this. They need to learn from this. James hesitated. Sergeant, I'm retired. I'm sure your instruction is excellent. You don't need an old man confusing things with outdated—" The instructor interrupted firmly. "Sir, with respect, nothing you could teach would be outdated. You just broke a 28-year record with iron sights. That's not luck. That's mastery. These Marines need to understand what real expertise looks like. Please." James looked at the young faces staring at him with newfound respect and awe. He saw himself decades ago, young and eager and certain he knew everything. "All right, Sergeant. What would you like me to address?" For the next 3 hours, James shared knowledge that no manual contained. He explained how to read mirage patterns that modern Marines relied on technology to measure. He demonstrated breathing techniques that created stability without equipment. He discussed the mental discipline required for extreme-range shooting, the patience to wait for the perfect moment, the confidence to take the shot when conditions aligned. He told stories from Vietnam, not of glory or heroism, but of technical challenges and solutions. How to maintain rifles in jungle humidity. How to shoot from positions that textbooks said were impossible. How to estimate range when no technology was available. The students took notes frantically, trying to capture everything, but James's most important lesson had nothing to do with shooting. "You have advantages I never had," he told them. "Better rifles, better ammunition, better optics, better training facilities. All of that is good, but don't let the technology replace the fundamentals. Don't let the equipment become a crutch. I shot iron sights today because I wanted to remind myself, and now you, that the rifle doesn't make the shot. The shooter makes the shot. Technology enhances capability, it doesn't create it. Master the fundamentals so completely that you could shoot effectively with any rifle, any sights, any conditions. That's the difference between being a technician and being a sniper." The senior instructor asked the question his students were thinking. "Sir, why didn't you come forward before? Why didn't you tell us who you were? We've been running training here for years. Your expertise, we could have used it." James's answer was simple and sad. "Because I'm 76 years old, Sergeant. Because I assumed the Marine Corps had moved beyond what I could offer. Because I thought my knowledge was obsolete, replaced by newer methods and better technology. I didn't want to be the old guy telling war stories nobody wanted to hear. I was content to watch, to see that the Corps I loved still produced excellent Marines. I didn't think I had anything left to contribute." The instructor's response was immediate and emotional. "Sir, you have everything to contribute. What you did today, what you shared this afternoon, it's exactly what we need. We can teach marksmanship, we can teach tactics. But that deep understanding, that mastery that comes from decades of experience, we can't teach that. We can only pass it on from those who have it. Please don't assume you have nothing to offer. Don't let that knowledge walk away." James was quiet for a long moment. "Sergeant, I'm an old man. I don't have a teaching certificate for your current curriculum. I can't keep up with young Marines physically. What exactly do you think I could—" The instructor cut him off. "Sir, I'm calling my commanding officer right now. We need to discuss bringing you on as a consultant. Guest instructor, whatever works. The Scout Sniper School would benefit from your experience. Other instructors need to hear what you shared today. You represent a direct link to our traditions, to techniques and knowledge that we're in danger of losing. The Marine Corps doesn't forget its own. We don't let valuable assets go to waste just because they've aged. You're not obsolete. You're foundational." Within a week, James's quiet retirement had transformed into a new mission. The Marine Corps Scout Sniper School officially brought him on as a historical consultant and guest instructor. He taught irregular courses on fundamental marksmanship without technological aids. He mentored struggling students who couldn't seem to master the mental aspects of precision shooting. He consulted on curriculum development, ensuring that modern training didn't lose sight of core principles in the rush to adopt new technology. The young Marines called him Gunny out of respect, though he'd retired as a master sergeant. He always corrected them gently, but they kept using the term anyway. To them, he embodied what a gunnery sergeant should be: competent, humble, dedicated, and impossibly skilled. James found himself needed again, relevant again, valued again. The range where he'd taken that impossible shot became known informally as James's Range. The 2,400-meter target acquired a plaque commemorating his record-breaking shot and his decades of service. Instructors used the story as a teaching example about humility, about not underestimating others, about respecting knowledge and experience, regardless of age. The lance corporal who'd noticed James's jacket patch became one of his most dedicated students. "You almost walked away," the young Marine said one day. "We almost lost all of this because we assumed an old man couldn't teach us anything." James smiled. "Never assume, Marine. That's the first lesson. Never assume you know someone's capabilities by their appearance, and never assume you're too old to contribute." Years later, when James finally passed away at 84, the Marine Corps gave him a funeral with full honors. Scout snipers from across the Corps attended. Men he'd trained in the 1970s and 1980s, now elderly themselves, stood alongside the youngest students from the current school. The senior instructor who'd witnessed that impossible shot gave the eulogy. "Master Sergeant James taught us to shoot," he said, "but more importantly, he taught us to see beyond assumptions, to see value where we expected weakness, to see that expertise doesn't diminish with age, it deepens. He taught us that respect is earned by knowledge and character, not by youth or rank or appearance. Every Marine who takes a long-range shot, who masters the fundamentals, who refuses to rely solely on technology, carries forward his legacy." The Camp Pendleton Range still bears his name. The record he set still stands. But his real legacy isn't measured in meters or medals. It's measured in the thousands of Marines who learned from him, directly or through his students, about what true mastery looks like. About patience, about humility, about the quiet confidence that comes from decades of dedication to a craft. James never sought recognition. He never demanded respect. He simply possessed expertise so profound that it couldn't be hidden, even behind age and an old canvas jacket. And when young Marines laughed at the impossible old man attempting an impossible shot, he taught them the most important lesson: never underestimate quiet competence. If you believe that true expertise speaks for itself, that age enhances rather than diminishes capability, and that we should listen to those who've walked the path before us, subscribe to this channel. We honor the stories of men and women whose skills and knowledge transcend time, whose quiet confidence teaches us more than any textbook ever could. Share James's story with someone who's ever been underestimated because of age. Comment about a time when you or someone you know proved that experience and wisdom have no expiration date. These stories preserve the lessons that each generation must learn anew. Respect is earned, competence is ageless, and the quietest people in the room are sometimes the most capable.